So artificial intelligence, it's the latest thing. It's pretty much the next step in human evolution. It came out seemingly when Siri was announced, maybe, 6 years ago? But artificial intelligence is actually close to 430 years old. The first automaton was presented by an emissary from the Japanese emperor visiting James I of England in the 1600s. It was a robot, it was a doll that could attempt to serve tea. There's a name for it, it's on the slides, so I can't recall it right now. But that's when the first automaton was recorded in history. 200 years later, a French and Swiss watchmaker created a writer, a doll called the writer, who wrote automatically. And that was another attempt in France and in Switzerland at automation. So this idea is not new. 200 more years, so about 100 more years later, in the late 1800s, there's a gentleman called Charles Babbage, who you might recognize if you read The Economist. And he basically lived his entire life designing something called the mechanical analytical engine. And the analytical engine was basically a self-replicating machine. Now, the perk here is that it was not actually physical, it was software before computers, so it never came to bear. Until someone during World War II had the beauty of inventing the Enigma machine to prevent the rise of Nazism all around Europe, and that was a code-breaking AI with mechanical spokes. So the idea of artificial intelligence is not breaking news necessarily. What's news is that the computing power is possible today. It wasn't possible in the 80s, it wasn't possible in the 50s when most of the frameworks that you see in AI today, people came up with them in the 30s and the 50s. What's changed is our computing power. Now, are the slides here? Almost, because I have a little bit up there. So basically, AI is not new. It's a new framework, and people right now are experimenting with ways to play with computing power to speed the way we can reason about an increasingly complex universe. Now, people like Ray Kurzweil, they see what they call a data explosion coming to pass. We're looking at something like 4, not petabytes, but the order next to it, exabytes. We're going from 4 to 144 over the next decade. That is basically the Library of Congress, and all the books in the Library of Congress, in comparison, is 12 terabytes of data. So this is an order of magnitude. And to understand all of this information, well, it's a challenge, and most of us struggle with it, and frankly speaking, given the disrupted nature of US politics today, well, that's a disruption. We can't make sense of our political data. Anyway, so I started with this one slide because I am a blockchain consultant along the side of running my own startup, and if you read it a little bit, that's what it feels like to be a blockchain consultant so far. Blockchain, 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 more blockchain, potentially side chains. Getting tricky. Now, blockchain is a lot of things, but it's not necessarily as groundbreaking either as it's being made to be. Again, what's being made possible today is the speed of computation. And the two coming together is one of the most disruptive changes in world business today. Okay, do you mind next slide? Okay, so that's me. We can even skip to the next one, actually. Okay, so this is kind of what I just explained to you, the evolution from the 1600s to today with automatic reasoning engines of sorts. We can skip to the next one. Have you covered it? Yeah. Oh, behind? Yeah, right there. So what is artificial intelligence really? Artificial intelligence is a bunch of statistical models that when they come together amounts to human-like reasoning at the biggest scale ever seen in humankind. It's pretty huge, but it's also relatively simple if you've taken grade 12 math of sorts or stats. There were attempts made in the 30s, 50s, and 70s, as I mentioned, and computing power is the reason why it's possible today. And with the rise of quantum computing and all the rest, it's about to skyrocket at a whole other level. Next slide. Okay, so how does this affect business? Why is AI so important for business? Well, business is data. We went from newspapers to telex, which is some kind of telephonic way of pulling data, to digital business, which pretty much requires us to actually have either e-commerce or digital businesses of sorts to exchange information with each other and thereby facilitate trade. Now, the next step here, with the rise of machine learning, things like transactions, foreign exchange identity verification, things like forecasting future risk with an enterprise setting, are being made phenomenally possible today, and predictable, which is even more, with the rise of machine intelligence, machine learning. So cognitive business is basically a framework that is mainly being championed by IBM right now. And IBM has been at the core of a lot of world businesses' key changes in terms of technology. And basically, cognitive business involves learning organizations. So no longer processing file cabinets and leaving them, hopefully the next generation of leaders go sift through them to learn lessons from previous management layers. No more. We've got business intelligence, learning, and teaching corporate managers how to handle business challenges better, faster, and smarter than before. The next one is the API economy. With the digital economy coming to bear and all of us producing data, we can now provide value to each other by exchanging our information through APIs. If you own a cell phone in this room, you're providing some kind of API to some company that is getting phenomenally wealthy, and I will not name Facebook. So faster transaction speeds across highly connected individuals, things, and spaces is giving rise to cognitive business. And cognitive business, again, is the ability to reason about highly complex data we never thought of before. The last one here is the end of the firm and the rise of the platform. So I'm not sure if many of you here have heard of the platform economy, but this is the next step here. Ronald Coase, who was the author of the transaction cost theory of business, the fact that the hierarchy that we have in business corporate leadership ladders is set as a waterfall technique, is because it maximizes the efficiencies that Ronald Coase pretty much came up with in the 60s. Well, that's no longer the case with Moore's law breaking, and Moore's law just means that things are getting twice as better every year type thing, if not more, actually exponentially. But the rise of the platforms is leveraging this increase in learning and computing power faster. Airbnb is a platform, Uber is a platform, Tinder is a platform. All of the New York Stock Exchange was a platform before the internet, and now it's being challenged by actual platforms, ones that we can look at transparently maybe. And it's not no plug for the Bitcoin crowd. Next slide. So business is getting smarter, pulling data from all sorts of databases, and this one just came live. Now, blockchain is the best database for collaboration ever invented. By that I mean, well, what is a blockchain? It's a distributed ledger, as you've heard. It means that if something happened, because of the shared ability of us to question whether it happened, we can prove with each other that something did happen without needing any centralized party. So it's shared, co-calculated, encrypted knowledge. So we just spoke about cognitive business, making sense of complex data with ever smarter computation, and now we have proof that things are happening around us. That's unleashing a tsunami of value. The next step here is, well, there's an absence in coordination, and that means that there's an exponential rise. If no one's checking, if no one's bothering, and everything is sturdy, anyone can have an imagination of sorts and code at 3 a.m. and come up with the next Facebook using blockchain data. Smart contracts. Who here has heard of smart contracts? Okay, so well, you guys are clued up. Smart contracts are basically apps that run on that peer-to-peer provable connectivity, and they allow for interaction that is highly provable without requiring a central institution like a bank or, well, some say a government, but I don't want to touch that. But you get the point. Very complex collaboration is now provably, reliably possible because of smart contracts. It just so happens that it's also software, right? Because if you can execute a future outcome, you can devise complex structures to make those future outcomes happen in specific ways. And that's where you get distributed apps in banking, insurance, healthcare, to name a few. A few of my colleagues are working in a way to make your health cards, if you're Canadian, actually accessible on the blockchain so that you don't have to check with every province every time you move. The most transformative bit about this is the rise of DAOs. Who here has heard of DAOs by any chance? Okay. And who here just answered and has heard of the DAO, like the event? Okay, so it's mainly cryptography crowds. Okay, so a DAO is basically an organization that runs itself. It's a botnet that people like for some reason. It's one of the simplest ways of explaining it. And DAOs are getting increasingly sophisticated. They're getting connected. First of all, they're blockchain-based entities. They're being tacked AI onto them, which means that they can affect some serious outcomes based on purely just shared data and no centralized sort of authority. And together, they're basically getting to a position where, depending on the right programming, they can actually orchestrate things like a takeover of an actual company. So if you look at political behavior today, there are networks of bots that basically game Facebook advertising in order to increase the bias of US voters, no legal commentary here, to get Trump to potentially win or get Hillary to potentially lose, no one knows quite yet. But these things have serious impact on the way business happens today. And right now, they're known as cyberpunk sort of hacking sort of phenomenons, but they're increasingly moving into legitimate official business. And the key thing here that I didn't add to the slides is there's an obscure Swiss law that allows for corporations to have full legal force without requiring a human person at the core of it. And this is the bit where the acquired companies comes in. So if you've heard of Crypto Valley in Zug, Switzerland, it's one of the best jurisdictions for this right now. And the next generation of programmers are getting busy creating DAOs that are incorporated in friendly jurisdictions that are now shifting, eating away at traditional business. Next. So, artificial intelligence and blockchain equals smart institutions. That's the point I'm trying to get at here. The combination of artificial intelligence and DAOs, and basically blockchains and the database components, is giving ways to things that look like full-blown institutions. Like, what if the UN was rewritten and run itself? What if a real estate company could trade with another? What if property could rent itself to you? These are things being made possible with a combination of AI and blockchain and what I'm calling cognitive blockchains. Next slide. So what does this mean to you? Well, this means, the next generation of CEOs in the world will not just need to understand human resources, operations, no. They will need to actually accept that machines are potentially smarter, well, they actually already are, they were when we were using calculators, to be frank. Now we've got to be comfortable of being surrounded by calculators that are effectively supercomputers with human natural language power. And our role in managing these next generation of businesses will be to almost be a maestro to this conflagration, this orchestra of AI solving traditional issues that were traditionally assigned to departments or specific experts that we trusted because they were the few in our geographic area that we knew to trust with that operation. So what is the next step that this means? Well, corporate entities now, companies like Facebook, Google, the rise of ICOs and their popularity, and the rise of DAOs is incentivizing corporate managers to consider things like initial coin offerings, and they actually are encouraging ideas like tokenizing Fortune 500 companies, like Facebook, like Google, like Goldman Sachs. What happens when Goldman Sachs has an ICO? And what happens when its DAO is smart enough to entrust your privacy, your financial well-being, because you have no human counterpart to know and trust, and know that things will get executed according to what you wished when you signed on for the service. Self-managing corporations. So who's used Uber before? I know they don't have them here in Vancouver. Okay, quite a bit. So Uber is a company that's, arranges for rides, in the most efficient way seen recently. The idea for these cars is to become self-driving as soon as possible. Well, the next step after that is self-driving cars like Uber will likely become AI-driven DAOs that are effectively real estate companies. And by that I mean their role will be to optimize the trade-off of return to risk depending on location at all times. Obviously, they will have human owners at some point, and they will be tokenized. So if Uber gets tokenized or something, that's what these self-driving cars will be self-managing themselves to do. Airbnb, just before, Airbnb is another one. everyone here knows of Gordon Gekko, everyone is aware of Wall Street. Well, they don't necessarily think that Airbnb is actually a high-frequency trading company. They're at any given time trying to assess the relative value of demand versus supply across properties valued at different prices. This will increasingly be done by AI-driven DAOs, given the way things are going and assuming that regulation somehow sifts the terrible from the extremely useful and life-changing. All right, this concludes my presentation. My name is Yves Messy, and I run a company called QGIS Technologies. We're based out of Toronto, London, and increasingly Shenzhen. And I'll be here until next Saturday if anyone sort of wants to connect, but that's my speech. Thank you. All right, so questions?
In terms of your company or whatever you're developing,
yeah.
What blockchain technology are you, or what flavor are you using?
So we're based on Ethereum now, and I'm a little bit biased because being based out of Toronto, where a lot of the Ethereum founding team sort of came to be, I got to know some of the perks of the platform, and that's the one that we're most confident about right now.
Sorry, what problem are you solving exactly?
Yeah. So we're solving the problem of political risk and the difficulties in using trust during the course of international investing. So if you've ever invested in a mine in a different continent, you've probably been aware that there are political issues along the way that severely affect the value of your assets that you wish you could quantify measurably without fraud. That's going to be what we focus on.
Okay, so the AI you're developing will compute the risk profile
exactly
better than
across different assets and geographies. Yeah.
Okay, but isn't that intelligence dependent on data even more than you are?
It is, and that's why it's an AI, not me.
But if data is the weakest link in the chain, then how does the AI get better than the human?
Data is not the weakest link in the chain. The sources are.
Okay, so the artificial intelligence can use other sources of data that human beings cannot.
Exactly. It makes sense of unstructured sources of information that we would not, connections that we cannot make easily. Obviously, the conversation is not about my startup, but I'm here after the talk to go into this with a little more depth, if you don't mind. Cool? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Beautiful. Anyone else? There you go.
Since I feel like the entire industry involves with so much cryptography, math, and artificial intelligence, machine learning in computer science, and the business side as well. So I'm just curious, what's your background from technology person or what major?
Okay, so the question is, what is my background being involved in AI?
Yeah.
I went to high school in sub-Saharan Africa, where I studied, well, I was in the engineering stream. And as being a political refugee, the first thing I did coming to Canada was to study the question of political risk. So I used my engineering sort of background. You know that some third world countries have a higher sort of engineering and math curriculum even before you get here. I was able to sneak that into the way we understand political science today. And obviously, as an investment analyst looking at emerging market transactions and some of the riskier geographies in the world, at least over the past 10 years, it was easier for me to get a little more sophisticated about it. And just as a background, we used to run our family office, so I've done international investing as well. That's part of the family tradition. Yes?
Yeah, at one point you mentioned the nature of the relationship between your AI and the blockchain, and that is to put decisions of the AI on the blockchain. Is that just like purely an auditing kind of thing, or?
Could you rephrase your question?
Okay. I thought I heard you mention at some point the relationship that you have, that you're creating between your AI and blockchain that you're running with. And it sounded like you were putting the decisions from the AI on the blockchain.
So to answer your question, you're pretty much asking what the relationship between the AI and the blockchain is when it comes to our startup. Yeah. Okay, and that, there are different ways you can go about it, and there are different ways we're relating with blockchain. We're using it to crowdsource investment research, for example. We're using it to prove the reasoning of what the AI is supposed to do over time. And we're trying to connect it to real-life outcomes in terms of the pricing of risks or the advising of risk management solutions. So there are different angles you can go about it. And as you know, you can connect AIs onto blockchain, like pretty much Numerai. That's what they do. They design AI models on top of blockchain data sets, and they design smart contracts to incentivize people to help them. Or you can go the other way around. If you're a bank using blockchain for transaction verification, you want to use AI models to verify your specific sort of transaction to make sure that you know your customer, you can prevent money laundering, and sometimes anti-terrorism finance regulations can be preempted by doing that kind of work. So there are different ways to arrange an AI and blockchain together, and it really depends on which pivot the startup has at any given time. Go ahead.
I don't have a really good understanding of how a blockchain can always be implemented. But my understanding is that the blockchain is relatively open source. And so when you're starting a blockchain AI-based startup, in order to get funding and show a business case for your business idea, is it like some sort of system where the blockchain is open source but the AI is private, and that's how you have your competitive advantage?
Yeah, so what you're asking is, because blockchain is open sourced and you're a startup, does that mean that your startup is open source? If not, how are you making money?
That's right.
Great, okay. So there are different ways you can go about it. I should say this, in the blockchain space there's understanding that, open source is the future. Traditionally, innovation has been very much cloistered, permissions, rule dependent with patents and everything else. But right now we're seeing the greatest amount of lucrative innovation from open innovations. Right? Ethereum is a foundation, for example, it's a non-profit. Yet it's probably one hell of a non-profit, if you know what I mean. So open source, the rise of the platform economy, as I outlined earlier, is incentivizing people to be open source more than rely on patents. And as a startup, you have to choose what business case you want to leverage. Either an open platform that everyone is using and trusts you to sort of expertly sort of advise on, or if you want to do something super proprietary, that only requires inter-party transactions with blockchains. Microsoft, for example, has a thing called Hyperledger, and it's a permission blockchain for an enterprise setting. And that means you can connect your AI to other companies' side chains and blockchains using frameworks like Hyperledger.
Just to add to that, open source doesn't necessarily mean impossible to make money.
Oh, yeah.
One local company, Active State, for example, they basically build out support packages around enterprise-ready package open source software.
The Linux Foundation is one of the greatest. I mean, if you ever use a Linux computer ever, or if you use a Mac, for example, well, I don't want to get into the politics of it, but basically they're leveraging open source as a way to make a lot of money as a result of the good work that they do. And maybe that's what's different about businesses of late. Any other question? Okay. Oh, go ahead.
What? Can I get a picture?
Oh my God. Absolutely, yeah.
Selfie.
My God.
Classic Drew.
Okay, well, before we end, I'm going to touch on a few examples of AI and blockchain combinations that you should probably look to after this conversation. So everyone's heard of a company called Numer AI, and they're basically a crowdsourced hedge fund that uses blockchain to keep everyone honest as part of the process. That's one of them. Salesforce just announced an AI that can allow their users to converse with their databases. And there's reason to believe that in the next few months to a year, some of that database will actually be a blockchain database, right? When it comes to us specifically, it's not in the public domain yet, but there's ways to radically transform the way we relate with news using databases such as blockchains. So that's also something to think about, because as long as AI or blockchain of the two direct real-life outcomes, or real-life outcomes can be verified by a database that we all trust, a lot of things are possible. So generally speaking, it's really important to look at how the two connect to see the next step in value-added sort of conversations, past the price of Bitcoin, which is something I was stuck on a little bit. Go ahead.
About news sources.
Yeah.
Couldn't you say the AI that you design would have its own biases based on how it was designed?
Yeah, its bias is to be fair according to logic. Well, so what I mean by that is, as humans, we're usually not exactly 50-50 when it comes to some of these issues. And if we have to price a lot of assets at the same time across geographies, it's harder for individual analysts to price fairly. Even I've done a decent amount sort of forecasting some of the major events lately. like Brexit, the Trump election, and all that. But I struggle with, for example, the Turkish election because I happen to know a lot of Turkish people on maybe the side that was not necessarily was pro-democracy type thing. So you can get very biased, and the AI system that we're developing is helping remove that element of affinity and actually use machine intelligence to complement our expertise when it comes to the political events happening across jurisdictions during the course of international investment.
But as I understand it, and this is a problem we talk about a lot in information science, the machine learning algorithms tend to be black boxes. So how do we really interrogate the actual bias underlying the logic or lack thereof? Because financial redlining was a problem with AIs for mortgage decisions. And so I'm just wondering if you have a vision for how we move beyond those kinds of problems.
So is your question, how can we keep the models honest?
Yes.
Okay. So, and that's a true issue because in the issue of equity, the issue of open and inclusive societies, when AIs are mainly developed by people who don't necessarily think about some of the broader implications of their work, it can lead to disastrous events. Like, you see people getting sentenced wrong. I think China, about a week and a half ago, announced, 2 weeks ago, they announced the first online-based court, right? Blockchain-based, probably, AI sort of court. Now, who is responsible for fixing that to make sure that there is not a lot of inequity happening? It's up to the philosophers, frankly, and then it's up to the engineers who design these for business use cases. But the business ethics of AI model development are one of the fastest growing areas of philosophy, from what I've noticed at least.
We've had one in DC for the past, almost a year.
This is a legal AI?
Yes.
Okay.
It's the DC online resolution portal.
Exactly. So, and these will come to be more used. So it's definitely something to watch, and maybe that's the next generation of political issues. Today we're still stuck on Trump. Go ahead.
Sorry, this is a bit speculative, but is there a threat to businesses like Facebook you mentioned before? It seems that blockchain technology lends itself to peer-to-peer, as was mentioned in the slides. And so is it just a matter of time before someone creates a fully peer-to-peer version of social media, which people would choose?
So I mentioned how the firm is over and the platform is here to replace it. Facebook is one of the biggest platforms ever made. And in the world of platforms, any peer-to-peer will have to have more users than Facebook, period. Or smarter AIs, but it's hard to get smarter AIs without the range that Facebook has. So personally, I wouldn't fret for Facebook's investors yet. Although I've seen efforts, and if you see the Whisper protocol on Ethereum right now, it's meant to actually increase peer-to-peer chat without delegating that kind of privacy and your personal data as some people are uncomfortable with. So it's definitely an area to watch.
I just wanted to point out there is also a local company working on something kind of disruptive for internet, rightmesh.io. You might want to check out. They're currently their primary market segment would be India, where there's high density and perhaps low access to data and internet. But that would be the starting point.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there will be a government attempt at having some kind of version of Facebook on blockchain that they control, for example. The politics of blockchain are hairy at best. Go ahead.
So when I think of a public permissionless blockchain, I think of immutability, availability, but I don't think about performance. So the utility of immutability and availability is obvious in this context.
Yeah.
Are there other use cases for blockchain that I'm not aware of?
Well, there's clearly identification, right?
Okay.
One that isn't usually, I wasn't sure if I was going to bring this up in this conversation, but a blockchain is very similar to a DNA strand, the way it's folding and it's unfolding. So if any of you are following biological computing, blockchain is a use case for that kind of framework in assessing information. Blockchain is phenomenal in terms of speed. I think Vitalik, who's heading the Ethereum project, Jeff Coleman with state channels, there are some phenomenal features coming on with blockchain in terms of speed, trust, reliability, and scalability. These things are some of the biggest issues in these development communities, and they're being fixed in a way that's rivaling existing institutions. NASDAQ processes a lot of transactions every single day. But if Ethereum, for example, or when they officially implement things like state channels, you're looking at 1 million plus transactions per second. Now, is that not a feature?
Right. It can transact quickly, but it can't store a lot of data or have that accessible. You can't query the Ethereum blockchain very quickly, right? You can store
Have
a
you
bunch of
tried
small
querying the
stuff.
Bitcoin blockchain?
It's a lot faster than that, but it's not like a cloud-based
So
enterprise level
the way it
data
is
system where
right
you
now,
can query it.
the way it is from what I've
enormous
seen,
amounts of
and if you've seen something better, do let me know. But the Bitcoin protocol is actually the slowest, and that's why we have Bitcoin Cash coming out, because people were trying to reduce or increase block size in order to see how scalable it would be. And Ethereum shines because smart contracts and things like state channels are enabling some of the fastest transactions that we're seeing on a blockchain. So assuming an exponential rate of increase, I'm not necessarily losing sleep yet over how slow Ethereum is.
Well, I'm not talking about transaction frequency, I'm talking about throughput of data. Like, if you want to store an enormous amount of data and have it available and immutable, then you need to have it verified on blockchain, but you probably want to store it in IPFS, which is a totally different system. So that's why I'm curious, like, beyond verification, immutability, and accessibility, what value does blockchain add to AI?
Legitimacy.
Okay.
Legitimacy. Because if you have people who don't trust each other, they'll trust the blockchain. They'll trust the math. They can do the math to check whether things did happen. And to me, that's the greatest killer app. Anyone else? Okay, well, thanks for having me.